I don't see Joel.
Hey, Chris, I'm here.
Oh, there we go. Hi, Joel.
Hello.
Well, it's 4:30. I'd like to call the Tuesday, May 19th, 2020 Moorhead Public Service Commission meeting to order. I think we don't have to read that statement since we have no customers to be heard in the area. I'd entertain a motion to approve the agenda.
Daley moves to approve.
Thank you.
Paulson seconds.
Okay, I have a motion by Daley and seconded by Paulson to approve the agenda. All in favor say aye.
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 Opposed? Seeing none, motion passes. Moving on to the consent agenda, I'd entertain a motion to approve the consent agenda.
Make the motion to approve.
Ashton.
Daley second.
Okay, I have a motion and a second by Daley to approve the consent agenda. All in favor say aye.
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 Opposed? Motion carries. Customers to be heard. I was informed that there are no customers to be heard. Old business, anybody have any old business? Okay, seeing none. Moving on to reports. Councilman Hendrickson. Did he drop off? Or is he there?
No, I'm here.
Okay.
I hear wind though, so I wonder if somebody, it's not me, but just a quick update. The FM MetroCog in Minnesota DOT gave a presentation to the Moorhead City Council. And basically what the report said, looked at the balancing needs of motorized and non-motorized traffic, business access. They also discussed their vision and recommendations for downtown Moorhead, US 75 South and US 10 East. So, and basically that took up the whole meeting. So, and that's all I have. Deb, did you want to add anything to that? Okay, that's it.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Public Service Commission, any updates, meetings that you've attended? Anything you'd like to add? Okay, I don't think there were any meetings or anything. So that brings us to the manager's report. Mr. Schmidt?
Sure. Quick update. So in the manager's report, we have our first quarter strategic plan updates. The commission sets the 5 strategic directions. Those are delivers safe, reliable, efficient, and economical utility services. It also has a strategic and financially strong background. Along with that, we want to have qualified, competent staff that are in a strong staff culture. And then we want to be a regional leader in utility services and sought after leadership for advice. And then the last one, of course, is MPS wants to be innovative. So those 5 directions are set by the commission. And then underneath those is a summarization in each section based off of division manager or division type goals or plans or strategic directions that they've got going for the next few years. This was adopted back in 2018, or if I'm correct, 2018. So this is the last year of a 3-year strategic plan. We'll be looking at potentially extending that for 1 year. A lot of that has to do with, first of all, COVID-19 is not allowing a lot of in-person meetings. The second part of that is the water division actually has a lot of major projects that are going to be coming to a close mid-year 2021. So that would actually be a good time for us to really, look at how we want to approach the next 3 years. Other than that, there's also some dashboards in there. So on a quarterly basis, all the divisions and some of the employee groups look at the overall electric division, water division, finance and admin, energy services, and provide information and statistics based on the last quarter's worth of information. So load control, peaks, set points, customers, and load management. Along with that, there's a lot of water statistics as well too, energy services, and then some financial information too. So those are all within the report that you can take a look at. A couple other things that were on the general manager's report. One was in regards to the Energy Conservation and Optimization Act. This is MMUA is pushing this at the legislature. This is really kind of deals with our SIP, our Conservation Improvement Plan. And if Dennis wants to come up, he can speak to it a little bit. No, he doesn't want to come up. There's actually just an update to the SIP plan and how that affects Moorhead Public Service. So that's in the write-up as well. And then finally, there's an update on the financials due to COVID-19. So I'm going to have Mark come up and just kind of talk through that a little bit. Mark Moreland's our controller.
Hi, Mark Moylan, and Controller, Moorhead Public Service. Just a brief update, as Travis indicated. We've been under COVID-19 restrictions or impacts for about 2 months now. And one thing, a couple things that we looked at is what was the impact on residential usage and what was the impact on industrial commercial usage on both electric and water over the last couple of months. As anticipated, we noticed that residential consumption was up this year compared to last year, 3%. We assume that most of that is due to the fact that more people are at home, staying at home. Weather does have a little bit to do with that. It was a little bit milder this April, but again, we can't quantify what impact that had, but it did make sense that the electric residential consumption was up 3%. In addition, the weather part of it, we know it was milder because the residential dual fuel consumption was down about 8%. And dual fuel is, a minor component of our residential usage, but we do track it separately because we have to do it for reporting purposes. The small general consumption, which is where we have our businesses, that was down about 6% year over year from April 2020 back compared to April 2019. The small general dual fuel was also down, or was up actually 6%. And the general service, which is our large industrial users, was down about 3% in April 2020 compared to 2019. From the water side, we noticed the residential water usage was up about 5%. Water usage isn't going to have a weather impact, so that's a true indication that there was a lot more usage at home. Apartment usage was up about 2%, again, staying at home, increased water usage. Commercial usage for water was down about 7%, and industrial usage was down about 4% in 2020 April compared to 2019. We also been tracking the collections process because that's a major concern with what's going on with the economy. Moorhead Public Service collections actually have been pretty good over the last couple months. The number of late accounts has stayed relatively steady, very similar to what occurred last year. On a rolling balance, we have about 15.6% of all of our accounts getting late, cutoff notices, which means that they were past due at least 1 month. And that's pretty consistent with what occurred last year and also for the quarters that we've been tracking over the last couple of years. So it's up slightly, but nothing to be concerned with at this point. We have about 20,000 accounts, so that means about an additional 200 were late this year past due than were late past due at the same time last year. So if you have any questions.
Right. Does anybody have any questions for Mark?
I do.
Okay.
Okay.
Is that Heidi? Yeah, there
Yep.
it is.
Thanks, Chris. Thanks, Mark. Can you explain what MPS is doing or can be doing to help people stay current with their utility bills during this epidemic?
Okay. At this point, we still have our standard processes, our assistance agencies that we work with throughout the year. So we are continuing to refer customers who might be having difficulty to those agencies. West Central Community Actions is our primary agency that we go to for assistance. And with the COVID-19, they actually had their crisis levels, it doubled. So normally they would have your standard allocation plus crisis funds of 600 per household that qualifies. The crisis was doubled up to 1,200. So there is funding available there for those that have been approved for West Central funding. So again, we encourage all our customers, if they're looking like they're past due on the electric portion of their bills, to contact that agency because they have funding available.
Okay. And what is funding based on? Is it based on income? Anybody qualify? What are the basic qualifications for that?
It's primarily income based on number of people living in the household. So again, there are some charts out on the Minnesota West Central Communities Action website. If you're interested, I believe it's WMCMCA.org. But again, do a search West Central Minnesota Communities Action, and they have online applications. They have an office here in Moorhead as well as a regional office in Elba Lake.
Okay. And the 1,200 is just a one-time, right? Is that like if you are extremely behind or have extremely high utility bills, you would qualify for the 1,200?
Again, I'm sorry, go ahead. Yeah, they'll cover what's ever related to the electric charges on the bill. So throughout the season, it's through the end of the season, which could end if the funding is still available at the end of September, and then a new calendar year starts October 1.
What about the water part? West Central doesn't do anything to help with the water portion? Or who could help with the water portion?
With that, we've been sending to Clay County Social Services or Lakes and Prairies. And Lakes and Prairies works with a number of other sub-agencies, such as the Salvation Army, local churches, and they can get people in touch with those agencies if they still have funding available. So our three primary referral agencies is West Central Community Actions for the electric, Lakes and Prairies for your other services, and then Clay County Social Services. Their qualifications, I think, are a little more stringent, so we kind of go to them last.
And we're still doing no shutoffs during this epidemic, correct?
That is correct, and we do not have a timetable as to when that would start. We are also not assessing late charges.
Okay. Awesome, thank you.
Yes.
Additional questions for Mark? Okay, how about any additional questions for Travis? Okay, then I think, oh.
I just have one quick comment for Travis. I was glad to see you mentioned the work you're doing with the city staff on some of the fee and billing issues and the fees and working out. And I know that's a complicated issue, and Chuck and I had a chance to touch base with staff, and I know they're eager to continue that conversation with you, but it's good to see some progress being made in that area.
Yep, no, thank you, I appreciate it. Yeah, we're working through several different items right now, trying to handle fees and payments and things like that, both internally and externally. So we're going to continue that. And the question for Heidi the question that Heidi had on when we would go back to disconnections, that hasn't been discussed yet, and it's something Chris Volker, city manager, and myself, and potentially Dan Molly as well too, will have to figure out and set some time frame once everything goes back to normal. But we'll be giving I would guess, a very long lead time to get everything back to normal.
Anything else for Travis or his report? Okay, then I think we need to accept his report. So I'll need a motion for that.
And move approval?
A second.
Okay, I have a motion by Durand, second by Paulson to approve the manager's report. Any further discussion? Seeing none, all in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, same sign. Excuse me? Oh, okay. Opposed, same sign. Motion carries. Thank you. We've accepted the report. Moving on tonight, item number 9, which is approving summer voluntary water restrictions. Mr. Schmidt?
Yeah, I'll start this, and I'm gonna probably have Jake Long do most of the talking, so. This is an annual thing we do every year, basically from May 20th till beginning of October we do. Sorry about that, my mic wasn't on. So I'll have Jake speak to most of this, but this is an annual item we handle every year. So we have voluntary water restrictions that start middle of May and roughly go till the beginning of October. I'll let Jake really speak to the details of this one.
Jake Long, Water Distribution Supervisor. This item in front of you is in regards of, like Travis mentioned, the approval of summer voluntary watering restrictions. Since 1990, the Commission has implemented voluntary lawn watering restrictions each summer. These voluntary restrictions remain in effect May through October. In 2018, the Department of Natural Resources approved Moorhead Public Service Water Supply Plan. This plan includes numerous actions that are planned with water shortages, one in which including notification and mandatory odd-even watering restrictions. Although voluntary watering restrictions are not required in the water supply plan, they are part of the overall conservation strategies and goals identified in the water supply plan. This is a good way for our customers to become aware of water conservation as well as a severe drought type situation if it occurred, in which case a mandatory watering restriction would be implemented. I'll give a brief summary of the voluntary odd/even restrictions. This is for lawn watering and car washing. They'll be limited to customers by street addresses. So customers with even addresses can use water for lawn watering and car washing on even numbered days of the week or of the month. Customers with odd street addresses can use water on odd numbered days of the month. This voluntary water restrictions are exempt for gardens and flowers and newly planted trees and shrubs. In 2013, the Commission implemented water conservation rates for the months of May and October. This is a seasonal component and an individualized demand reduction component based on winter rates. The conservation component applies to monthly water usage in the summer that exceeds 150% of the customer's average monthly use in the winter months of November through April. A press release will be issued to distribute this information to our customers, and I also encourage customers and anyone else to visit the Moorhead Public Service website for helpful tips on water conservation. Any questions?
Madam Chair, I have a question. This is Chuck.
Okay, thank you, Chuck. Go ahead.
Jake, when does it go from volunteer to mandatory? Do you know what the bridge is there? Just kind of curious.
What was that? It kind of cut out a little bit.
Sorry about that. When does it go from volunteer to conservation to mandatory?
With the water supply plan, there's kind of a tier system that's based off of different drought stages. The plan identifies different tiers for the different capacity of the water, like a water shortage.
And where do you get those drought stats from? Is it from the National Weather Service or is it in-house?
Yeah. I want to bring Mark Pritchard up here for some of
Okay.
that.
Hello, Mark Pritchard, Water Plant Supervisor. To answer the question of where the metaphorical line is drawn between stages, it has to do with the National Weather Service's drought preparedness indices that they have. In the recent past, Moorhead Public Service had worked to create what was called the Buffalo Aquifer Management Plan. That is a component of that same National Weather Service information. And mainly it's to make sure that the utility is able to provide for residential use at all times. So in the event that we go from basically normal to stage 1, the restrictions that would be in place would be fairly mild, and then depending on the severity of the drought at hand, it would ratchet up to stages 2 through 4 to make sure that at all times, again, the residential supply will always be there. So it would start off with cutting off lower tiered end users, such as high capacity agricultural wells for watering in fields, for instance, and then it would kind of draw its way back into town so that, again, the residential supply would always be present.
Okay, and have you seen any forecasts for this summer? Is it supposed to be dry, wet time? And
Tough to say. Depending on what drought model you look at, you could get a wide variety of answers. Depends on what indices are really used. So far this year, it's looking to be somewhat average to more wet than usual. We've been in a pretty historic wet cycle these past few years, and they're anticipating that to continue. I don't foresee that changing unless we see some very significant localized weather pattern changes in the near future.
Thank you both very much. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mark. Thanks, Jake.
Thank you. Any other questions regarding the voluntary water restrictions? We're seeing no movement. We'll go ahead and entertain a motion to approve these restrictions.
I'll make the motion.
Thank you. Second?
Moran will second.
Okay, great. I have a motion by McDougall. Is it McDougall? I'm sorry, Sebastian.
Yeah, you're right. It's
Okay.
McDougal.
It suddenly blanked on me. Move to approve the summer voluntary water restrictions. Any further discussion? Okay, seeing none, all in favor say aye.
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 Okay, opposed, same sign. Yes. Yes. Sorry, I did not repeat that. Motion carries, so the restrictions are approved. Item number 11, the 2019 audited financial statements.
Sure. I'll start to speak to this. So this past fall, we entered into an agreement with Eide Bailly from 2019 to 2023 on an annual basis review our financials or do our audited financials for us. I'm going to have Mark Moylan come up and speak to this year's audit findings, and then we've also got Brian Stavanger on from Eide Bailly, and he'll give the overall report as well too. So Mark, if you want to come up.
Mark Moylan, Controller, Moorhead Public Service. As Travis indicated, this is to accept the 2019 audited financials. The audit occurred by Eide Bailly, was conducted by Eide Bailly, overseen by Mr. Stavanger, audit and partner at Eide Bailly. Work started in January when we first started to load some of our documents onto their online secure portal so they could begin some preliminary work. They did on-site work at Moorhead Public Service the week of March 2nd through the 5th. And then from that point, they did their internal review, and then we put together the final report that you have in front of you in April and fine-tuned it, made sure everything was accurate and reviewed. And at this time, I'd like to turn it over to Mr. Stavanger so he can give you their summary.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you. It's my understanding that the presentation will be controlled by someone there, so I will just make sure to indicate when the slide should be advanced, and we'll walk you through the results of the audit. Everything good so far?
Give it 1 second. You're on the video right now, Brian. I think we got to bring up the PowerPoint. Hang on 1 second. All right, go ahead, Brian.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you again for the introduction. I'll walk you through the results of this year's audit. And what we've done is we've taken the financial statements that are prepared by management. Those are upwards of 50 pages now, or close to 50 pages. And we've done a summarized version of those for the purpose of presenting to you. The first half of my presentation is going to be more about what the audit means, the process, which Mark already described much of that. So we'll be able to get through that pretty quickly, and then we'll look at some of the actual financial results. The benefit of using this executive summary presentation style is it does allow for some more historical information. The annual audited financial statement that you have, that 50-page document, really only contains 1 year and some summarized information for 2 years. But we're able to put 5 to 10 years worth of information in this executive summary, so it really can identify and look at and analyze some trend information. So the next slide after the cover page is the audit recap, and then we'll skip to the next slide after that, which is audit recap at the top, objectives along the right-hand side. So when we are doing really any audit of any entity, we have to follow generally accepted auditing standards. That's really the overarching standards that we have to follow if we're auditing a private company, a bank, a gas station, or Moorhead Public Service. In addition to following those standards, there's some more stringent standards issued by the federal government, the government auditing standards, just a little bit more tight and in depth that we have to follow. So really following two separate standards. When we do the audit, what we are doing is we're obtaining reasonable but not absolute assurance that the financial statements prepared by management are free of material misstatement. And really what that means is we are not looking at 100% of the transactions. If we were to do that, we would be there for much of the year. It would be very costly, and I don't think Mark would be very easy to deal with if we were there much more. So we are doing a lot of sampling and looking at the more higher risk areas, and we are doing enough to obtain reasonable and giving you our reasonable assurance that the financial statements are accurate. And that really is following those normal auditing standards. So we include things we examine things on a test basis. We provide or obtain evidence that support all of the amounts in the financial statements, the disclosures in that 50-page document. We do that through third-party verification as well as working with management to provide that evidence. A lot of discussions with management throughout the process. We're also looking at, are you following the correct accounting principles? So not only are the numbers accurate, but are you presenting them the way that the accounting principles require? Unfortunately, it's not a simple cash in, cash out. There's a lot of accounting principles that have to be followed. So we're also making sure that that's happening. And then the last item on this slide is looking at significant estimates. So a lot of the numbers on the financial statements are verifiable. There's cash in the bank, there's investments, there's long-term debt that's owed. But there's also items that are estimated. And those two items are other post-employment benefits, or OPEB, and the net pension liability. Those estimates are done by third parties, really handled by actuarial firms. So we obtain the reports from those actuarial firms. Really those reports are given to management, and then we get those reports from management, and then we just ensure that all of that information flows through properly to the financial statements. Next slide, still on the audit recap, is the timeline. Mark really went through that already. That was really the typical timeline. We were able to get actually on site just before everything hit, and we were no longer able to do that, and we had to work remote. We have a lot of audits that are fully remote this year, but thankfully we were able to get on site and complete the bulk of our work on site at City Hall. The next slide is audit results, and I'm going to pause just briefly there to make sure if anyone has any questions or comments that you have the opportunity to ask those in this unique setting this year. Any questions up to this point? Hearing none. So after the audit results page, the next slide at the top, it says audit opinion. So when you hire an auditor, and specifically when you hired us, Hyde Bailey, to perform the audit, ultimately what you're asking for is for us to do all of our work and then in the end provide our professional opinion based on our audit procedures. And for the 2019 audit, MPS received a clean audit opinion. That's an unmodified opinion, which is really the best opinion that you can get and the one that you want to get on a consistent basis, and the one that MPS has received on a consistent basis. Really what that means is within that document, that audited financial statement document, within there, the financial statements are prepared using the correct accounting principles. They are fairly stated and fairly presented. So really following all the rules that need to be followed, all the reporting that is required, and we give you that clean, unmodified opinion. That's our opinion based on all the work that we've done, and then we provide that for you. In addition to that audit opinion, the next slide, at the top of that slide, is findings. In addition to our opinion, we also would issue any findings. And there's really two areas where we would have findings. The first area within the financial statements, and more globally, really within the internal control structure of the organization. So getting from the customer receiving their bill, paying their bill, and ultimately being reported within your financial statements, that whole process, we review that, and in the end had no financial statement findings. There are also several legal compliance areas that we are required to look at, that the state of Minnesota requires us to look at through the audit process. Also had no findings in relation to the Minnesota legal compliance. So I'll pause here again before we actually get into some numbers, just to see if there's any questions regarding the audit process and the audit results for 2019. Okay, hearing none, we'll move into some numbers. The next slide is cash and investments. So we're going to spend some time looking at the cash and investments and what it looks like combined for MPS as a whole, as well as individually between the electric and water fund. So the first slide that has some numbers and a graph at the top says cash, bond reserves, and investments. So we believe in really every year analyzing these reserves, these cash balances, these investments. It's really been highlighted in the last couple months that cash is king. I've heard that term a lot in a lot of webinars I've sat in on. And I truly believe that if you have a strong cash and investment position going into this pandemic, you're likely handling it a lot better than an organization that has very low cash reserves or minimal cash reserves and is looking elsewhere for how are we going to get through this. So looking at cash, reserves, and investments is important, but this page really only gives you the numbers, and there's some large numbers. So after this page, we're going to look at, really what does that mean for operations and liquidity. But in total, between both the electric fund and the water fund, the far right there in 2019 or at the end of 2019, roughly $33 million in operating cash, bond reserves, and investments. And you can see below the table that's broken out into each category, but combined roughly $33 million. And for the second straight year, coming in over that $30 million threshold. Big numbers, a lot of numbers. So we'll want to analyze that and put that into what does that look like for cash on hand or liquidity. The next slide is getting more of a focus just on the operating cash, the top of that slide, operating cash. So taking some of the information from the previous slide and just looking at the cash on hand, so ignoring the bond reserves and the investment, but what is the cash on hand? And then breaking that down into the distribution between the water fund and the electric fund. You can see, really for all 10 years on this graph, the electric fund holds most of the operating cash, but in total between water and electric, total operating cash about 12.7 million at the end of 2019. As you look at this graph, certainly was some cash growth starting in 2016, but really a jump from 2018 to 2019, and that was intentional. Towards the end of 2019, knowing that there would be an early payoff of a $7 million bond in the electric fund. Some investments were converted to cash towards the end of 2019. so that early on in 2020, that cash could be used. And that was about a $7 million bond payoff in early 2020. So it really accounts for all of that growth from 2018 to 2019. But very important to understand why that cash increased so much. It definitely was intentional. So I've teased a few times that these are the raw numbers, and they are very large numbers. We want to look at and analyze what does that mean from a liquidity standpoint. The next slide, titled Cash and Investment Reserves, and it lists on the left-hand side a 1, 2, and 3. Really the importance of having reserves. Number one, bond rating agencies love seeing reserves. It does increase your bond rating. The reserves, it depends on your reserves. It also produces investment income and a source of working capital to meet cash flow needs. If you have strong cash and investments reserves, especially in an organization like Moorhead Public Service, where you do have a lot of capital projects, a lot of significant capital projects, you do have the ability to not only finance that 100% through long-term debt, but you can utilize existing reserves to help offset some of that long-term debt and ultimately some of that interest that has to be paid back. And number three, I think, is especially important in times like this, when there's unexpected expenditures or potential revenue shortfalls, which earlier on in tonight's meeting, management shared with you, fairly minimal impact up to this point in the last 2 months. But there's a lot of unexpected into the future, into at least the short-term future. So having cash and investment reserves is very important to have that cushion to allow you to continue to operate. Okay, ultimately, what is the days cash on hand? That is the next slide. Days cash on hand is a representation of how much cash do you have on hand to essentially operate and pay your operating expenses. So this is broken out between the electric, which is blue, and the water, which is green for each year's. And then I've also identified on there what your target is. The target was set back in a meeting in December of 2017. The target for electric is 200 days, and the target for water is 225 days. Now, of course, that's going to fluctuate, but it's good to have a policy to kind of shoot for. You see at the end of 2019, that electric fund cash, days cash on hand, continues to grow and has exceeded the target of 200 days and sits at 291 days. So you could operate without any revenue coming in. You could continue to operate for 291 days in that electric fund. The water fund is a little bit lower, came in at 214 days at the end of 2019, slightly under the target of 225, but really right there. So in the water fund could operate for 214 days without any revenue coming in. Some good, strong cash position, right around or exceeding your target levels. So at the end of 2019, good strong days cash on hand. I'll pause there. We're going to get into results of the operations next, but make sure I want to pause and allow for any questions or comments. Hearing none, we'll continue on. The next slide is kind of a transition slide, operations, and we'll move on after that. The following slide has electric fund at the top. And this slide is a representation of the last 10 years. What are the operating revenues in that electric fund? What are the operating expenses? The third line down on that graph, I would call it a red or maybe maroonish line, is the difference between the revenues and expenses, or the operating income. And then the very last line on this graph are the annual transfers out. Those annual transfers out are to the city's general fund, the economic development fund, and the capital improvement fund. So generally, as revenues increase, expenses follow the same pattern. As revenues decrease, expenses generally follow a similar pattern. So you can see those first three lines are fairly similar in proportion, really for all 10 years. Some slight changes in 2016 to 2017 as there were some rate increases, but very, very consistent in the last 3 years. Operating income, this graph does not include any non-operating activity, such as interest income, any miscellaneous income, the payment of interest expense. So it is very important that you do generate operating income. You need to be able to generate that to pay any long-term debt, as well as contribute to any reserves, as well as make those annual transfers out. So at first glance, if someone said, oh my gosh, you're generating in 2019, 13.6 million in operating income, it is very important that there is positive operating income to pay your debt, to make those annual committed transfers to the city. Operating income is very important. The next slide incorporates not only the operating income, or what's titled here operating margin. I'm sorry, the top of this next slide is electric fund margins. So the blue in each year is that operating margin. It's really converting the number from the previous slide into a percentage. What type of margins are you generating just from your operating activities? And then the green is your net margin. So that really is then accounting for, after you pay your long-term debt, after you make those annual transfers out to the city, what is the resulting net margin? In 2019, the operating margin was exactly the same as 2018, 31.2%. After all non-operating activity is accounted for, including debt service and the transfers out, that net margin was 12.9%, a slight increase from 2018. You can see really, really good consistency from 2017 through 2019 on both the operating and net margins in this electric fund. The next slide is on the water fund, but I'll pause briefly before moving into the water fund to see if there's any questions or comments on the electric fund operations. Okay, the next slide, we've just got, I think, 3 remaining. This slide with water fund in the header. The same as the electric fund, looking at just the operating activity, revenues, expenses, what is the operating income, and then the annual transfers out. In the water fund also has some annual transfers to the city, this time to the general fund and the capital improvement fund. Very, very much the same as revenues increase, expenses tend to follow. Tends to be a fairly stable operating results in the water fund, very similar to the electric fund. The next slide, at the top, water fund margins. Set up the same way. You've got the blue, which represents the operating margin, so just solely operations and really taking the information from the previous slide. And then the net margin after all transfers are done and any non-operating activities such as interest income and debt service payments are made. What are the end results? The operating margin in 2019 in the water fund, the far right side of this graph, 18.9%, a slight increase from a slight decrease from last year. And then the net margin, after all non-operating activities included, actually increased it a little bit to about 20%. Very stable from the last 2 years, but overall in the last 5 years, a slight drop in the last couple of years compared to 2015 through 2017. I've got one more slide with a graph on it, and it's really taking into account all activities of Moorhead Public Service. So before getting into that one, I'll pause again briefly to see if there's any questions on the water fund. Okay, one more slide. At the top, titled Debt Service Coverage. If there's one slide that I would look at as your auditor and really as just analyzing your finances, this would be the slide. The business you're in is a capital-intensive business, a lot of infrastructure investments, and a lot of that having to be financed through long-term debt. So as you set your rates, there's a lot of decisions or a lot of criteria that goes into that decision making. You know, really the number one thing for me is make sure you're generating enough operating cash and operating margins to be able to pay your long-term debt. Don't want to be defaulting on long-term debt. So this debt service coverage is a quick recount for the last 10 years of what kind of coverage do you have, what kind of cash flow is being generated on an annual basis to repay the principal and interest obligations on your long-term debt. When doing this, really 1.00 is the minimum you want to be at. And what that would mean is that for every dollar that you owe in principal and interest, you're generating $1 of positive cash flow from operations. So if you're generating anything under the 1.00, you're having to dip into reserves just to pay your long-term debt, let alone having to transfer funds to the city and any other non-operating activities. So really 1.0, the minimum. The first 3 years of this graph, much lower than the last 7 years. And really at the end of 2012 had paid off some construction notes for the water treatment plant. So at the end of 2012, after those notes were paid off, you saw an increase in the debt service coverage. This has been very, very strong in the last 7 years and continues to be strong even in 2019. 2.61 is a very strong debt service coverage, generating more than enough operating cash to be able to pay those long-term debt obligations. After paying those long-term debt obligations, this is just looking at debt. Also understanding there's some significant obligations to make those annual transfers to the city, as well as contribute to reserves going forward. So 2.61 is a good, strong place to be to pay your debt and then have some left over for those annual transfers and contributions to reserves. The next slide is just really the last opportunity for any questions as it relates to anything in the audit process, anything I've talked about in this presentation, or maybe any other questions that anyone would have.
Any questions? Thank you, Brian.
You're very welcome. Thank you.
Give it a second for everything to sink in, and then we'll go ahead and.
I'd like to thank staff and Ide Bailey for the work they put in on this to get everything cleaned up and get it taken care of while we were doing part of it remotely, not all of it.
Right.
So again, thanks admin and finance staff and Ide Bailey for their help on this.
Okay. Well, I'm ready for a motion to accept the audit financial statement.
So moved, Daley.
Okay,
I'll second.
was that you, Joel?
Sebastian.
Oh, Sebastian, okay. I see Joel's face. Okay, I have a motion by Daley and seconded by McDougall to approve the 2019 audited financial statements. Any more discussion? Okay, seeing none, all in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, same sign. Okay, we've approved it. We're not closing the meeting. You'll note the upcoming meetings. And unless there's an objection, I'd entertain a motion to adjourn.
All motion to adjourn.
Thank you.
Daley second.
I have a motion by Paulson, second by Daley to adjourn the meeting. I don't think it's discussion, but all in favor say aye.
Aye.
All right,
Aye.
thank you. Motion carries.
Thank you.
Meeting's adjourned. Thank you for coming.
Have a good day.